1 year ago, Duchess Eleanor Sinclair died when her carriage overturned on the North Road. Blackthorn Manor has been silent ever since. Duke Edward Sinclair buries himself in ledgers and estate business, rarely stepping foot in the nursery. His 6-year-old son, Charles, hasn't spoken more than a few words or laughed once since he watched his mother's carriage go over that ridge. 6 governesses have come and gone in a year. Charles refuses to look at any of them. The staff have stopped expecting a 7th to last. Then Rose Winthrop arrives. She's younger than the others, plainly dressed, carrying a single worn trunk. The housekeeper warns her before she even reaches the nursery door. The boy doesn't talk. Don't expect him to. Rose only nods and walks in anyway. She doesn't kneel down and coo at him the way the others did. She doesn't ask him questions he won't answer. She simply sits on the floor across from him, pulls a wooden toy sword from her trunk, and says, "I hear this nursery used to have pirates in it. Shame. I was hoping for a proper sword fight." Charles stares at her, says nothing, but he doesn't look away either. That evening, Duke Sinclair returned from London earlier than expected. He walks through the front doors, braced for the usual silence. The empty halls, the closed nursery door, the quiet that has followed him for a year. Instead, he hears something that stops him cold in the entryway, a sound he hasn't heard in 12 months. Charles is laughing. The Duke moves toward the nursery like a man in a dream, afraid that if he walks too fast, the sound will vanish. He reaches the doorway and freezes. Inside, Rose is staggering dramatically across the rug, clutching her chest, defeated in an epic sword battle against a boy wielding a wooden blade twice his size. Charles is laughing so hard he can barely stand, tears of joy on his face. The Duke doesn't announce himself. He simply stands in the doorway, watching his son laugh for the first time since he buried his wife. Rose finally notices him. She freezes, embarrassed, expecting reprimand. But the Duke says nothing. He only looks at his son, full of life for the first time in a year, and then at the young woman kneeling on his nursery floor, still holding a child's wooden sword. For the first time since Eleanor died, Blackthorn Manor is alive. Duke Sinclair cannot stop staring at the governess who accomplished in a single afternoon what no physician, tutor, or grieving father managed in an entire year. Charles begins speaking again, but only to Rose. At breakfast, he whispers his answers to her instead of the maid. In lessons, he'll only recite his letters if Rose is the one holding the book. The staff notice. The Duke notices more. Rose starts taking Charles into the gardens, the ones Eleanor once tended herself, now overgrown and forgotten. She doesn't ask permission. She simply begins pulling weeds beside him, teaching him the names of flowers his mother used to grow. Slowly, quietly, she restores small routines nobody else remembered. A Sunday walk to the pond, a bedtime song hummed just off key, leaving the nursery window cracked open for the morning birds. Duke Sinclair watches all of this from a distance, unsure what to make of it. He tells himself he is merely observing his son's progress, but he finds himself lingering in hallways longer than necessary, listening for Charles's laugh, and for the voice that seems to summon it so easily. One afternoon, he catches Rose teaching Charles to skip stones at the pond, the exact spot, though he says nothing of it, where Eleanor used to take him as a baby. Charles smiles every time Rose claps for him. It unsettles the Duke, how effortless it looks. The household begins to whisper. The cook remarks that the manor breathes different since the new governess came. Even old Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper who buried 3 governesses' hopes in the past year, admits she's never seen the boy attached to anyone so fast. But Rose carries something she shows no one. Each night, once Charles is asleep, she slips out a side door and crosses the frozen grounds to the manor's abandoned chapel, the one nobody has opened since the funeral. She lights a single candle at the Duchess's grave and lays fresh flowers, always the same kind, white lilies, Eleanor's favorite. She never stays long. She never explains it to anyone. and she makes certain no one sees her go, or so she believes. One night, the Duke cannot sleep. He notices a light moving across the dark lawn and follows it out of curiosity, staying well behind the trees so as not to be seen. He watches Rose kneel at his late wife's grave, arranging the lilies with careful hands, her head bowed. He almost steps forward, almost asks why a governess he hired only weeks ago would grieve his wife, as if she'd known her. But then he hears her speak, so quietly he almost misses it, the words carried faintly on the winter air. "I promised I would protect him." The Duke goes still. Protect him, not care for him. Not watch over him, the way any hired governess might say of a charge. Protect, as though it were a vow made long before she ever set foot in Blackthorn Manor. He wants to step out from the trees and demand an answer, but something stops him. The same instinct, perhaps, that told him not to trust so quickly. Instead, he watches her rise, brush the frost from her skirts, and walk back toward the house, without ever knowing she'd been seen. The Duke stands alone by the chapel a long while after, staring at his wife's grave, and for the first time in a year, a new kind of question keeps him from his sleep. Who exactly is Rose Winthrop? The Duke secretly witnesses Rose whisper, "I promised I would protect him," and realizes the new governess is hiding something far deeper than grief. Rose is given permission to organize the late Duchess's private library, a task no one else has wanted to touch since Eleanor died. Books untouched for a year, dust thick on the shelves, her handwriting still visible in the margins of old novels. While clearing a locked writing desk in the corner, Rose finds a false bottom in one of the drawers. Inside is a small wooden box, and inside that, a sealed letter. The handwriting on the front stops her cold. "To the woman who will one day care for my son." It is unmistakably Eleanor's hand, the same elegant slant Rose remembers from years of letters passed between them. Rose's fingers tremble as she breaks the seal. The letter is short, written in the unhurried voice of a woman who suspected, perhaps, that she wouldn't have much time. Eleanor writes of her fears for Charles, that grief might harden him, that a father lost in mourning might forget how to hold his own son. She begs whoever reads this letter to love Charles freely, fiercely, as if he were her own. "Whoever you are, I trust you were sent to us for a reason. Please, don't let my son grow up in silence." Rose sits with the letter pressed to her chest, tears sliding down her face, but there is no surprise in her grief. Only recognition, because Rose already knew this letter might exist. Years ago, before she ever set foot in Blackthorn Manor as a governess, Eleanor had told her about writing something like it, a promise tucked away in case the worst ever happened. Rose had hoped she would never have to find it. She folds the letter carefully and slips it into her pocket instead of bringing it to the Duke. She tells herself she needs time, that the Duke has only just begun to trust her, and a letter like this, proof that she may have known Eleanor long before arriving at his door, could unravel everything so quickly. But hiding it changes nothing. It only delays what she already knows is coming. Later that evening, while placing returned books back on a high shelf, Rose knocks loose an old framed portrait tucked behind a row of novels. It falls, the glass cracking against the floor. She kneels to gather the pieces, and freezes. The portrait shows a much younger Eleanor, perhaps 18, standing in a garden Rose doesn't recognize, and beside her, arm linked with the future Duchess, unmistakably, impossibly younger, is Rose herself. She stares at her own face, staring back at her from years ago. For a long moment, she doesn't move. She had hoped this portrait no longer existed, that no evidence remained of the years before Blackthorn, before the promise, before everything went wrong. Footsteps sound in the hallway outside. Rose scrambles to hide the broken frame beneath a stack of books, just as the door creaks open. It's only a maid, passing by, gone in seconds. Rose exhales, her heart still hammering. She wraps the portrait in a cloth and hides it inside her trunk beside the letter, telling herself she'll find the right moment to explain everything. But some secrets don't wait for the right moment. They find their own way out. A faded portrait, hidden for years behind Eleanor's books, reveals the truth Rose has been guarding. She once stood beside the Duchess as a young lady's closest companion. The Duke finds the portrait. He hadn't meant to search Rose's things. But Mrs. Pratt mentions a broken picture frame missing from the library, and something in the Duke's gut tightens. He goes to the library himself, checks the shelf where it once hung, and finds only dust in its place. He knows, somehow, before he even opens Rose's trunk in the governess's quarters, what he is going to find. The portrait. Eleanor, young, laughing, arm in arm with a girl who is unmistakably Rose Winthrop. Beneath it, the letter. He reads his late wife's words in a room that suddenly feels too small to breathe in. To the woman who will one day care for my son. His hands shake by the time he reaches the end. When Rose returns from the gardens with Charles that evening, the Duke is waiting in the hallway, the letter and portrait in hand. Charles is quickly sent off with Mrs. Pratt. The Duke's voice, when it comes, is low and sharp. "How long have you known my wife?" Rose doesn't try to lie. There's no point anymore. "Since we were girls," she says quietly. "I was her companion before she married you, her closest friend. And you said nothing." The betrayal in his voice cuts sharper than anger. "You came into my house, into my son's life, and you said nothing. Because I didn't know how," Rose admits. "Because I was afraid you'd send me away before I ever had the chance to keep my promise." What promise? Rose closes her eyes, and the whole truth finally spills out. The night before her wedding, Eleanor had pulled Rose aside, gripping her hand so tightly it left marks. She'd been strangely afraid that night, Rose recalls. Afraid in a way brides shouldn't be. Eleanor made her swear one thing: if anything ever happens to me, find Henry, find our son, before grief destroys him. Rose had promised without understanding why it mattered so much. She didn't learn the truth of that fear until a year ago, when news reached her that the Duchess was dead. She came to Blackthorn Manor as soon as she could, only to be turned away at the gate by Eleanor's relatives, who told her the Duke wanted no reminders of his late wife in the household. She was dismissed before she ever saw the Duke or Charles. It took her nearly a year and a false name on a governess registry to finally find her way back through the front door. "I didn't lie to hurt you," Rose says, tears slipping free. "I lied because I was terrified of losing him again, losing Charles, before I ever had the chance to keep my word to her." The Duke stares at the letter in his hands, then at the woman before him, no longer a stranger, but someone who has carried his late wife's last wish farther than he ever knew existed. The anger in his chest, the suspicion he'd been holding on to since the chapel, all of it drains out of him at once. He sits down heavily, the letter still trembling in his grip, and for the first time since he buried Eleanor, since the funeral, since the silence swallowed his house whole, Duke Edward Sinclair weeps. Rose doesn't move to comfort him. She only stays, quiet, letting him grieve the wife he lost in a way he never let himself grieve before. When he finally speaks again, his voice is hoarse. "She trusted you with our son before she trusted anyone else. She trusted you too," Rose says softly. She just needed to make sure Charles would be loved either way. Outside the door, unseen by either of them, a shadow lingers a moment too long before slipping away down the corridor. As Rose leaves the nursery that night, someone watches from the darkened hallway and murmurs under their breath, "She remembers too much." The old stable master, Mr. Farrow, asks to speak with the Duke privately. He's carried something heavy for a year, he says, and can't carry it any longer. Not since he's seen the boy laughing again, since he's watched the house come back to life. He tells the Duke that the wheel on the Duchess's carriage didn't simply break that night. He'd inspected it himself the morning before, as he always did, and it was sound. But by evening, before Eleanor left for the North Road, someone had loosened the bolts, carefully, deliberately, in a way meant to look like an accident. He'd stayed silent out of fear. Powerful people, he says, don't take kindly to stable hands with accusations. The Duke asks the only question that matters. Who had access to that carriage? Pharaoh hesitates before answering. Only family, Your Grace. Only someone who knew the household. The name settles heavy in the room before Pharaoh even says it. Lord Edmund Ashcombe, the Duke's own cousin, next in line for the title, should anything happen to both the Duke and Charles. The Duke feels sick. Edmund has dined at his table, played chess with him on quiet evenings, sent gifts to Charles on his birthday. The betrayal, if true, runs deeper than he can stomach. That same week, something changes in Charles. He begins waking from nightmares, clutching at Rose's sleeve, murmuring fragments he's never spoken before. Pieces of memory long buried finally start surfacing. One evening, sitting in the garden with Rose, Charles goes very still and says, in a small voice, "Mama said not to trust Uncle Edmund." Rose freezes. "What else did she say, Charles?" He struggles, the memory slipping like water through his fingers. "She was scared. The wheels were making a funny noise before we went fast." He doesn't finish. He doesn't need to. Rose brings this straight to the Duke, and together with Pharaoh's account, the picture becomes undeniable. Eleanor's death was no accident, and the person who orchestrated it has been standing close to Charles ever since. Close enough to try again, if he ever suspects the truth is surfacing. The Duke realizes, with a cold dread, that Rose and Charles are both now in danger, simply for knowing what they know. He wants to send Rose away, somewhere safe, far from Blackthorn Manor, until Edmund can be dealt with. Rose refuses. "I made a promise," she tells him. "I'm not leaving Charles now, not when he needs someone steady more than ever." The Duke understands, even as it terrifies him, that pursuing the truth means turning against his own family, exposing scandal that could destroy the Ashcombe name in front of all society. But protecting his son, and the woman who brought his son back to life, matters more than any title. He begins quietly gathering evidence, questioning old staff, sending discreet letters to men he trusts in London. He tells no one of his suspicions, not even Edmund, who continues visiting the manor as though nothing has changed, smiling at Charles, complimenting Rose's care of the boy. But 2 nights later, Rose doesn't return from her evening walk to the chapel. Mrs. Pratt finds Charles crying in the nursery, asking where his governess has gone. A search begins immediately, servants fanning out across the grounds with lanterns as the temperature drops toward freezing. Near the edge of the frozen lake, half buried in snow, one of the search party finds something that stops the entire household cold. A ribbon. Rose's ribbon, soaked dark with blood. Rose has vanished. Only her blood-stained ribbon remains beside the frozen lake, and Duke Sinclair realizes the woman who saved his son may have paid the price for uncovering the truth. The household believes the worst. Whispers spread that Rose drowned trying to cross the frozen lake, that the ice gave way beneath her. Mrs. Pratt weeps openly. Charles refuses to eat, refuses to sleep, clutching the wooden sword Rose once fought him with, as though it might bring her back. The Duke refuses to believe it. A blood-soaked ribbon does not mean a body lost to ice. It means violence, and violence has a source. He thinks of Edmund's calm smile, his easy visits, and something in him hardens into resolve. For 3 days, Duke Sinclair barely sleeps. He rides the estate's edges himself, questions tenants, pays informants in the nearby village, refusing every suggestion that he wait for the authorities to act. On the 3rd night, an old groundskeeper mentions an abandoned hunting lodge on the far edge of Ashcombe Land, a place Edmund inherited years ago and rarely mentions. The Duke rides through the night alone, snow driving sideways, until he finds it. A crumbling lodge with smoke curling faintly from its chimney. Inside, guarded by 2 of Edmund's men, he finds Rose, alive, bound, bruised, but breathing. Relief nearly buckles his knees before fury replaces it. Edmund himself appears from the shadows of the lodge, unsurprised, almost amused. I wondered how long it would take you. Let her go, the Duke says. Edmund only smiles wider. Give up this little investigation of yours. Walk away. Tell the world the Duchess's death was an accident, and Miss Winthrop lives. Continue digging, and I promise you, cousin, she won't be so lucky next time. The Duke looks at Rose, at the fear and defiance both burning in her eyes, and understands there is no bargain here he can trust. Edmund has already proven what he's capable of, so the Duke does something no one expects. He doesn't fight. He doesn't bargain quietly. Instead, days later, he stands before the House of Lords, the very body that could strip him of everything, and speaks the truth aloud, for all of society to hear. He confesses his late wife's death was no accident. He names his cousin. He declares, before men who could ruin him with a single word, that he is prepared to surrender his title, his inheritance, everything his family has held for generations, if it means saving his son and the woman who saved his son first. The room erupts in disbelief. Scandal ripples through London within hours. But the confession does something Edmund never anticipated. It forces the truth into the light, where it can no longer be buried in a frozen lake or a hunting lodge. Old Farrow, the stable master, finally comes forward publicly with what he'd hidden for a year. Proof the carriage wheel had been tampered with, and a name he'd been too frightened to speak until now. A servant of Edmund's, paid in silence, who finally breaks under questioning and confirms everything. Edmund's carefully built conspiracy collapses within days. He is arrested at Ashcombe Land before he can flee to the continent, the same lodge where he held Rose captive, becoming the final piece of evidence against him. Rose is brought back to Blackthorn Manor, weak but alive, wrapped in blankets before a roaring fire. Charles refuses to leave her side, holding her hand as though he might lose her again if he lets go. Before exhaustion finally pulls her under, Rose looks up at the Duke, tears slipping free, and whispers the only thing that matters to her. I kept my promise to Eleanor. The Duke takes her hand, Charles's small fingers still wrapped around her other one, and for the first time in over a year, he allows himself to believe that Blackthorn Manor might finally be safe. With Edmund arrested and the truth finally out, justice is served. But as Rose drifts into exhausted sleep, the Duke realizes what he feels for her has become something far greater than gratitude. Months pass. Winter thaws into spring, and Blackthorn Manor is unrecognizable from the silent house it once was. Charles laughs every day now, real, unguarded laughter that echoes through halls that once only held grief. He runs through the corridors with the wooden sword Rose gave him, challenges the footmen to duels they always lose on purpose, and sleeps through the night without nightmares for the first time in over a year. The nursery, once a place the Duke avoided, now overflows with music and noise. He finds himself drawn there in the evenings, not out of obligation, but because he cannot imagine being anywhere else. Rose has fully recovered from her ordeal at the lodge, though she still visits the chapel some evenings. Not out of secrecy anymore, but simply because it comforts her. The Duke often joins her now. They stand together at Eleanor's grave, not as strangers bound by a dead woman's letter, but as two people who loved her in different ways and found each other because of it. He has begun restoring Eleanor's gardens properly, not to erase her from the manor, but to honor what she built. Rose helps him choose the flowers. Lilies, always, planted nearest the chapel. As the estate prepares for its annual spring celebration, the first the household has properly celebrated since Eleanor's death, the Duke makes a decision he's been carrying quietly for weeks. The celebration fills the manor's great hall with warmth and candlelight. Tenants and staff and old family friends gathered together for the first time in years. Charles weaves through the crowd, delighted, refusing to sit still for a moment. Midway through the evening, the Duke calls for quiet. The hall stills. Rose, standing near the edge of the room in a soft green gown, has no idea what's coming. The Duke steps forward, holding something in his hand. The letter. Eleanor's letter. The one that started everything. "A year ago," he begins, his voice steady despite the weight of the room's attention. "This house had forgotten how to laugh. My son had forgotten how to speak, and I had forgotten how to hope." He unfolds the letter carefully. "My late wife left behind a request, a promise she asked of whoever might one day care for our son." He reads a portion of it aloud, his voice catching only slightly. The room listens in reverent silence. "She asked that woman to love Charles freely, as if he were her own." He looks up, finding Rose across the hall. "That woman found us. She kept a promise, made years before she ever walked through our doors, and in doing so, she saved my son's life, and gave him back his laughter." He pauses. "She saved mine too." Rose's eyes fill with tears as the Duke crosses the room toward her, the entire household watching. He stops before her, takes her hand, and, to the gasps of the gathered guests, lowers himself to one knee. "My late wife asked one thing of the woman who would care for our son," he says quietly, "just for her now, though the whole room can hear. I ask something more." He looks up at her. Everything he's felt since that first evening in the nursery, finally spoken aloud. "Will you stay, Rose? Not as Charles's governess, as his mother, and as my Duchess." Rose presses a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely now, and manages only a single word. "Yes." The hall erupts. Cheers, applause, someone weeping openly near the back. Charles pushes through the crowd of legs to reach them, and the Duke pulls his son up into the embrace, along with Rose, the three of them wrapped together, as the household celebrates around them. Outside, church bells begin to ring across the valley, carrying the news toward every corner of the estate. Later, as the celebration winds down and the candles burn low, the Duke stands at the window, with Rose beside him, watching Charles chase fireflies across the newly bloomed garden, laughing without restraint under the spring moonlight. "I thought loving her again would mean forgetting Eleanor," the Duke says quietly. "But it didn't. It became the bridge that led us back to each other." Rose leans against him, watching Charles's laughter carry across the garden like something finally, fully alive. The manor that once echoed with silence now rings with laughter, as three hands, father, son, and the woman who fulfilled a promise made years before, walk together into a future built not on forgetting the past, but on healing from it. Thank you for watching. A hidden letter, a secret promise, a carriage accident that was never an accident at all. This story had more twists than you expected, didn't it? If you love Duke romances packed with secrets and revelations, like and subscribe to Duke Tales by Mia. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Did you guess Edmund was behind it before the reveal? Comment below.